Hey, hi, and hello, and welcome back to 12 to 60 Comics. You know, I've been spending a lot of time in my last few videos talking about eBay, talking about how to sell comic books, all of the things I've learned over the last 5 months, having entered into this journey of trying to sell my comic book collection, which has been really an amazing experience for me. I love learning new things. I love research. I love, watching all the YouTube videos and trying out new things and sharing that with you, the things that I've done right, the things I haven't done right. And that's been really great. And I feel like I've really enjoyed that experience, and I am going to continue to enjoy it. But one of the things I haven't really talked about a ton is how much meaning I have been finding in reconnecting with my collection as I go through it, as I go to the storage unit and I sort through the different boxes, which are in a complete, disorder right now, and just going through them and discovering, it's like that thing where you're kind of mining through and suddenly I come across a box that contains comics I haven't thought about, in decades or years. And, the memories that those evoke for me in terms of, people that I connected with, my friend Miriam, who owned a comic shop, my friend Brian, who I have since collaborated with on, making comics, friends that I had in high school, just different experiences that I've had over the years, and how so much of my story in my life has been around being a comic book collector. And I think, and it's so funny, because like right now, as I'm diving back into it and really reconnecting back to my collection, I'm certainly tempted to like stop selling them and start buying them again, because it's exciting and it's fun, and I feel that energy, and I have to admit I've bought a couple, but I'm trying to resist that. I'm trying to resist that. But one of the things that has come up for me while doing this is thinking about, and particularly looking at all of the different Facebook forums and pages and all the YouTube videos that are out there by comic collectors and comic resellers and sellers and comic fans and comic professionals, and following various writers and artists on their Facebook pages or on Blue Sky or wherever. And one of the things that has really come up for me in a good way, I think, is just to reflect on, what kind of comic collector am I? And have I been? And it's really interesting. We think of like comic collecting as sort of one sort of very generic hobby, but it's within the community. There are a lot of different ways to collect comics and a lot of different approaches people take to it. And I think the most important thing is to know that you're the comic collector that you are in the moment. How you collect, why you collect, what you're hoping for when you collect may change based on your circumstances, on your age, on your interest, on your resources. And there's no right way to do it. I think sometimes I'll see in the comments people who, I don't know if it's gatekeeping or if it's just being judgmental, but some people will say, well, that's not the right way to do it. Or if you get your book slabbed, you're not a real comic fan. And I'm not defending slabbing books. I don't particularly love it, but I totally get why people do it. And I'm not going to sit here and judge people for slabbing books, because that is a legitimate way to collect books. You think about like, what are the different ways, what kinds of a collector can you be? Some people get into it because they just really love the stories, and they really love the art, they really love the characters, and they are perfectly happy getting low-grade copies of things. They're happy just grabbing the comic books that come in on Wednesdays. They're not hunting backwards. They're not, they're just sort of like the modern day collector, which is, and I'd say it's more the sort of modern day fan, which is, I'm walking into a comic shop and I'm looking through the stacks and I'm looking for the books and characters and artists and writers that interest me, and I'm going to start buying them, and I'm just going to keep them, and in that way I'm going to become a comic book collector, right? And maybe some folks who are doing that are really into sort of collecting the sort of all the different characters, not characters. Yeah. Maybe some folks, this is probably true of producer Marlo, really get into and energized around sort of like new creative things, independent things, creator-owned things, and they're looking for things off the beaten path. Or maybe there's people who are just really into the whole variant cover collecting. Now, that's never been my gig. I've talked before about how I don't love variant covers. I don't like all of the different covers that come out. But I get, that that's a legit way to focus your collecting, is to have, and there is something that's kind of nice and unique about having a variant cover because it's more rare, it's potentially more valuable. So there's this sort of, variant hunter. There are the people who are just looking to explore, the unknown, the rare, the unusual. Books that are sort of indie or, smaller press, or books that didn't get a lot of attention when they first came out. And maybe there are some people who just collect underground comics, and which is actually fewer people than I would have suspected. I would have thought there would have been a lot more. My wife and I were going through some old things the other day, and we found her first ever issue of Hothead Paisan from back in the day, and she has them all. And I don't think there's any way I'm going to ever get her to part with them. But, that is a very rare and special book, and it reflects a certain time in life. And it was definitely kind of an underground book. If you're not familiar with it, you should look it up, find it. It might not be to everyone's taste, but it certainly was to ours at a certain particular point in our lives. There are other kinds of, I think when I started, just speaking of myself personally, because I think I've gone through different phases. When I started collecting, I was just a kid. I was just buying the books that I could, where I could, when I could. So, again, that was going to the spinner at the grocery store. And, they were all the newsstand copies. None of them were in good shape, just because us kids would just rifle through them. And so, I collected. I bought the books that were available to me. So, I was really into DC then. So I bought a lot of Legion of Superheroes. I bought a lot of Green Lantern, Green Arrow. I bought a lot of Justice League. I bought the occasional Avengers. Those were some of the main books that I bought there. And I didn't get them consecutively, partly because I didn't have just tons of money. I had like my little allowance, and I could maybe buy like 2 or 3 books. And so I'd have to pick and choose which ones I could get that week. And the other thing was, I was never guaranteed that book would be there for me. Some other kid would grab it before I did, right? So I was just sort of like a happenstance. I was a kid, and my collection began with just stacks and stacks of books that I was never going to get rid of because I loved them. But they were sort of not continuous, and they were not in great shape. And then later on, when I became sort of like an older teenager and starting into college, then I got really more serious about making sure that I had consistent runs. This was sort of like around the time of the New Teen Titans. And definitely I had gotten into Uncanny X-Men at that point, and Iron Man. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss any issues, because we were really beginning to see a greater development of sort of these of these ongoing storylines. I know that I have some of the detectives from that time period that had some really great storylines, and I wanted to make sure I didn't miss them. And I had a friend who worked at a bookstore, and she was really great. And she would, when the comic books would come in, I would tell her which ones I wanted, and she would set them aside for me, and then I would come in and buy them. And that was a great way. That was my first sort of beginning of a pull list. And then when I got to college, I found a such a nerd. I was such a little geek coming from Anchorage, Alaska to Boston, to the big city of Boston. And I was so out of touch and so like not cool at all. And I found a comic book store. Many of you who are from the Boston area will recognize the name, Newbury Comics. It was in Back Bay on Newbury Street, not very far from my dorm. And I would walk up and I would go down the street, down Newbury Street, and I'd see this comic book shop. And I don't know why, it took me a while to muster up the nerve to go down there, because it was one of those shops that was kind of like below street level, and you had to like walk down little stairs, and it was really dark. And the other thing that was really funny about it was that it was very much sort of a punk, new wave music, goth scene then, dating myself. And I remember the first time I walked in there in my like, khakis and my polo shirt or my rugby shirt and my stupid, I don't know, whatever. I was not blending, let me just tell you that. And I walked in and I walked and it was, Newbury Comics was dark. It was like loud music that I did not recognize pounding. And it was just bin after bin after bin of vinyl albums. It was all of this music. It was all of these people who did not look like any people I had ever associated with in my high school. And I totally nerved out and just like kind of turned around like, oh, I just have made a huge mistake. And then I don't know what it was. I think I ran into somebody who looked a little bit more like, oh, comic book guy. And he said, oh, he asked me, what I was doing there. I was like, oh, I thought it was a comic book store. And he's like, oh, you got to go to the back. And I'm like, oh, okay. So then, I forayed back down in there, and way to the back of the shop was the comic collection or section. And that guy was super nice, and it was a little bit well lit. They had some back issues, but they had something that I had never even, experienced before, which was you could do a pull list. You could do your own box. And so I listed out the comics I wanted, and they actually gave a discount back in the day. And I'm going to, just between all of us, I don't even think Newbury Comics, which I think still does exist, I don't think it sells comics anymore, but it's still called Newbury Comics. I don't know. Get in the comments if I'm completely wrong. But anyway, so that's how I bought my comics for, the time that I was in college. And it was great. They were really good about it. I would go, I'd buy my stack of comics, and then I'd go back to the dorm and I would read them. And that was me beginning to be sort of a completionist. Like, I had series that I loved, and I would follow those series. Again, I didn't have a ton of money, so I wasn't really exploring a lot of new things. I certainly wish now that I had explored a little bit more titles that were sort of on the edge, or, this is the late 80s, mid to late 80s. So, that was kind of the next phase. And then, I went to law school, started working, and there was a period of time there when I really couldn't afford comic books before I started practicing. And so I was busy doing all that stuff. So I kind of dropped off buying comics, and I would only buy them sort of intermittently. And then when I started collecting again, I started being more of a hunter, because I had missed a big chunk of the late 80s and 90s and wanted to and had heard all about the speculative times and wanted to go back and fill in my collection. So that's when I would start to really okay, I had my books. I looked back at the books that I'd gotten when I was a kid, and I'd seen all those little gaps. And then I saw those big solid chunks of, when I was in college, and I had these nice runs, and gosh, weren't they pretty? And didn't I want my other sets to be nice runs? Yes, I did. And now I'm picking up with all these comic books and starting to explore new artists and new writers. And now I want to go back and I want to find their work, because, frankly, at that point I had a little bit more spendable income. And also I was traveling a ton. So I found a friend, Miriam, who owned a comic shop, and she was awesome, and she had huge back issues. She was awesome in so many ways. She introduced me to somebody who had a warehouse, and I could buy books there at a discount. But I was also traveling a lot, and I would carry in my pocketbook, I would keep a couple of index cards of the books I was looking for, and suddenly I was a hunter. And that was super fun. And I would buy a ton. Number one, I would go to a lot of different comic shops all over the country, and I would just collect all kinds of stuff. I would come back from a business trip with 20 or 30 comics in my bag, and that I loved. And I started to fill in those gaps, fill in those runs, start some new runs. And then I started to get a little bit more particular. I started to really think about, for me, it was writers that I really loved. And, I wanted to expand beyond DC and Marvel, which had been my, bread and butter for ages. And so, thinking about people like Gail Simone and Brian Michael Bendis with the Powers and series, and I think that was one of the first big creator-owned kind of books that I started to collect. And J. Michael Straczynski and Warren Ellis, and I just started to really expand sort of the kinds of books that I was reading, to the point where I was really looking more forward to those creator-owned books, the Vertigo books, the Icon books, the Wildstorm books, the Image books, some of the Dark Horse books, things like that, even more than some of the mainstream DC and Marvel stuff. And so I think towards the sort of latter part of my time as a collector, I was really focusing more on, Greg Rucka and Brian K. Vaughan and, who else? There was somebody else Ed Brubaker, and some of these other writers whose work I just really enjoyed, Kelly Sue Connick, and there were so many others, but I'm not going to bore you with a list of names. But that became the kind of collector I was. I've never been the kind of person who collected for the investment sake. I know that there are people who do that, who are really retentive about that. Retentive is the wrong word. That is a bad word. It seems judgmental. Who are really attentive. I should have said attentive. Who really are focused on that. They do their research. They really shop around for books of a certain grade. There are people out there who just hunt number ones. There are some people out there who will pick a particular title, like a Silver Age title, and we'll try and fill that out. I mean, how fun is that? There's a guy on YouTube, Kevin, who does a series called Doc's Comics. Highly recommend it. He's really great. He's kind of talking about, being on the exploration for these different Silver Age series that he's trying to fill in. And I think that's super fun. There are people who will only do high-grade books. There are some people who only do low-grade books. The other day, I was on Facebook, and there's a guy and his daughter, and I think this is adorable. They're collecting coverless books. How cool is that? Anyway, I don't know. This is just me reflecting on what it means to be a comic collector. And going through this process of reconnecting with my collection as I'm letting it go has really made me a little nostalgic, I guess. And I'm just really grateful for having had the opportunity and the resources and the time and the opportunities, I guess, to be part of this comic collecting community in all the ways that people engage with it. And I think it's all interesting, and I think it's all fun, and I think it's all valid, and I think it's all worthwhile. And I just hope that everybody in the community feels that way. And I hope everybody in the community feels welcome, and that there is no right way to collect comics. There's no right way to do it. Just do it, and it's totally worth it. Anyway, that's just my reflection for the day. Take care.